Hello everyone. Thank you for watching, for starting to watch this lecture. I hope you're gonna enjoy it. Like it's gonna last for about 1 hour, hopefully. And we're gonna discuss like a book by Michel Foucault, which is called Disciplinary and Punish, Surveiller et punir in French, which talks about the birth of the prison. The picture that I chose in the background is the Presidio Maximo in Cuba, in the Isla de la Juventud, and is a prison complex structure around the idea of Panopticon that we'll discuss later on during this talk. As you can see, it's no longer in use, and this is also one of the reasons why I chose it, because obviously it will connect with the whole idea that I will try to present today. Um, we will start trying to analyze what is the historical context in which the book was written. It was 1975, and why it's important for us still today, and how it connects to our lives, to our society, to the way in which we relate to power. We'll then have a brief history of how we moved from different models of punishment and criminal justice. So from torture up to the idea of prisons. And then we'll discuss disciplinary power, this particular form of power that Foucault finds at work as a support and as a mechanism and a technology that sustains the existence of prisons in our society and also of other institutions. And then we'll discuss the Panopticon, which is this famous figure that Foucault made famous and that you can see in this picture of these examples of those prisons in Cuba. Before we start, I would like to pose a big question, which I call a big question because it was the question that for me triggered all my attention and my passion for not just for this topic but for the work of Michel Foucault. Um, since I found this question written on the cover of the Italian edition of the book, uh, it really blew my mind. Unfortunately, the question is not reproduced in the English version of the book, but it's a very interesting question because it makes you wonder. It's an invitation to wonder, why do we think that prisons are so normal? We've all been so used to the idea of prisons that we don't even question it anymore, and instead we should question it. And Foucault puts it brilliantly because he says those who steal, they're imprisoned. Those who rape are imprisoned. Those who kill are imprisoned. All in prison, basically. Any kind of crime. But where does this strange practice and the curious project to lock up in order to re-educate come from? What I emphasize is that we need to, I would like you to approach, we need to approach the idea of prison from this perspective. We should consider it a strange practice and a curious project. What does it mean to put somebody into a cell behind bars in order to re-educate them? This is the big question, and it basically is a perspective that allow us to detach with what is too familiar to us, like the self-evident character of prison. That's how Foucault call it. We all think that what else? What is the alternative? There is no other option to prisons. What are you gonna do with criminals? And yet, the idea is exactly that. We should still think that is very strange, and it shouldn't be normal to think of prison as something that should be so common in our societies. Why do we study the birth? Because it will be surprising to learn that these prisons have not been around forever. and definitely not forever, and not for that long either. But it's just like little 200 years, 2 centuries only, in which criminal justice has been completely colonized by the idea of prison. And when we think of the birth of something, we can imagine the death, its death. Or maybe we can demand or expect, not just expect it, demand the death of prisons, like the prison abolition movement, not that popular today, but definitely it never disappeared. Since the start of prisons, like there's always been this line saying like no to prisons, like all prisons should be abolished. And this is my perspective. I'll be completely honest with you, because I think knowledge is always partisan, has always had to do with this expressing a political idea. Even when they try not to express a political idea, knowledge is about political ideas. It's a mixture of knowledge and power, as we will see with Foucault. And I know that everybody's asking, so what else? Like, if we're not gonna have like prisons, what are you gonna deal with? I want to stop you there, because the reality is that like nobody ever asks us like what do we want, what we want in terms of organizing our life, organizing society. So we never really come up like with a big proposal of how life should be organized. uh, I don't like to work. I didn't like to go to school, and but still I had to, and nobody asks me beforehand, what do you propose? So given that nobody will ever ask us like what do we propose in terms of uh, what else instead of prisons, we have the full right to criticize it, to resist it, to protest, and to reclaim its abolition. What is the historical context in which this book was written? As we say, like it's 1975. In the picture I chose is a prison revolt in France in the early 1970s. And as you can see, this picture reminds many other kind of riots and prison revolts that were really frequent during those years. We have on the right the Attica prison riot in 1971. It was a particularly famous riot because like he ended up quite brutally with the police reclaiming access to the prison by shooting tens of prisoners, of inmates. As you will not fail to see, the prison population in Attica was predominantly black. Uh, I visited Attica in 2015 after a Foucault conference, and it was like a particularly deep experience. It's a maximum security prison. After the riot, it became extremely uh, securitized, let's say, and the racial distribution of bodies within the prisons hasn't changed. So you have like a predominantly black and Latinos population of inmates, but 98% of the prison wardens are white. We are in Buffalo, state of New York, and I mean like the kind of contrast is extremely strong, and it tells a lot that prison is not just like a neutral kind of system, but it's like a system of class domination, as we will see later. The one in the center is an issue the Gruppo de Información sulla prison. They definitely don't pronounce it this way, but I like to pretend that I speak French, which I don't. Which was like a group of activists organized by Foucault himself, like as we will see in a second. Now, what is interesting is that those prison revolts in the 70s are not isolated facts. In 2020, like in March, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had more than 22 prisons that went in prison protests all around Italy. in total, they calculated that it was around 6,000 prisoners being in protests, with many people dying actually, in mysterious circumstances. But actually, well, we can assume what happened, obviously. So this idea that prison is still today a contested place should help us realize the importance of understanding its genealogy, its birth, what it means, what it implies. Because, like, what I want to try to let you appreciate in this trajectory is that there is some form of continuity between us and our little struggles, our everyday struggles in various different contexts, and the struggles that somehow are symbolized, not just symbolized, but are uh, emerge from the prison system. Michel Foucault is this guy, as you can see. He's not just a philosopher, he's not just an historian of ideas, but he's also an activist. This book is like from 1970s, 1975, and it comes from his activism with the Group of Information on Prisons, which was trying to understand and gain information and mobilize this information in order to contest the prison system in France. There are many pictures of him you can find in against the police in demonstrations. So a really active role is not just about researching for the sake of researching. It's not just talking for the sake of talking, but it's studying the past in order to change the present. And hopefully that's what we're trying to do here as well. I mean, like with the due proportions, but I mean the idea of knowledge as something partisan that needs to be used in our own struggles. Let's start like with with this strange history then. Like this is like a quite brutal picture with which Foucault starts the book. The book starts with a awesome, to some extent, although terrible, description of this massive torture. I mean, you can see 4 horses connected to this body in the middle of a square. Obviously, the horses are pulling in 4 different directions. You can imagine the pain. And yet, that was not enough to kill the Robert Francois Damien. So there were like, it was a long, long ceremony, a long, long ritual of execution. Was the 28th of March 1757. Damiens was the last regicide, or condemned to regicide. He actually didn't kill the king. He attempted to kill the king. He didn't even get close to kill him. King Louis XV. And this was the punishment for the regicides, and by drawing and quartering, like an awful torture that lasted for hours and hours. The same kind of torture was like prescribed to regicide also in England and in many other countries. So it was quite a common, unfortunately, kind of practice. But as you can imagine, many many crimes were punished through this kind of tortures. Even the investigations were kind of formed part of this torture process, this ritual, this ceremony of power, as Foucault called it. And it's basically what happens in these moments is the expression of the revenge of the sovereign. The regicide, like, is the massive enemy, the ultimate enemy of the king, of the sovereign. And torture, it's his vengeance. And it's vengeance that happens in a public space. It's a public spectacle. Because it's not just an excess of force and a display of force against the offender, but it's a public display of force in which the sovereign, attacked, pushes back and shows that, like, there is no space for attacking the king. There is no leniency against who attacks the king. And the scaffold is the place where this takes place, where this execution takes place. Now, interestingly, obviously, when you gather a lot of people together, you can always have a crowd. You always have two possibilities. Either the crowd is cheering you, is cheering the execution because they are forcefully and convincingly supporting the king and its sovereign power, or it can happen the other way around. And this is one of the main reasons why those kind of practices were dropped. In most of these occasions, the people and the crowd didn't really support the execution, sometimes intervene against the execution, and obviously this slowly they became a moment of popular unrest, which is always the main problem for power. When resistance and solidarity happen, power needs to react. Now, the reaction took different phases. He had as a first form, Foucault points to these reforming jurists. Cesare Beccaria is possibly one of the most famous of them. 10 years later, the killing of, we just seen, of Damiens, he publishes on crimes and punishments, in which he expresses this horror for this violence that criminal justice was using against criminals. Now, the horror, though, and the humanity is talking about is not so much the humanity of the executed, of the criminal. Possibly doesn't even care about them, or not that much, but is the humanity of the people that are watching it, and especially is the humanity of the judge that doesn't want to feel that guilty, doesn't want to feel guilty of that violence. So how do we fix it? So first of all, it's an idea that is emerging, of this bourgeoisie that is taking over from aristocracy. We're approaching the French Revolution, so we're approaching the beheading of all these kings and queens and of the aristocracy in general. And we have a society based on the juridical subject of the contract. We're all equal, right? So if somebody is committing a crime, he's not just going against the king, but is against all of us, against the society. And we have the right to punish him or her because he's committed something against us. It's a side of the contract. Now, we want to punish them. Oh, that's the idea of the Cariano mine and the idea of the reforming jurist. They have to punish him or her, but this punishment needs to be lenient, they say, a calculated penalty that doesn't affect that much the body of the condemned, but its soul. And it's not just its soul in the sense of changing its behavior, leading him to repentance, leading him to reflect on what is done and why he moved away from society and how he can come back to society. But it needs to be also a lesson for everybody. Everybody needs to watch it and think, well, I don't want to behave that way. That's why I need to obey. That's why I need to behave properly. It comes to my mind now that song from the Animals, "The House of the Rising Sun." Tell your children what I've done. It needs to be a lesson, right? And they imagine this punitive city in which people are doing forced labor, those condemned, so they pay back their debt to society, but at the same time they can sort of give a lesson to everybody. Now, this never happened. I mean, those principles were laid out pretty carefully, but actually what happened instead, it was the emergence of the prison. And this was happening in a very specific period of time, which lasted in France. Yeah, I needed to tell this beforehand. This is the history of prison in France. It's pretty similar to the histories of other countries, but it's Foucault deals specifically with just historical material from France. Now, it happened that most of the prison, even elsewhere, were built exactly in those same 20 years, between 1810 and 1830. So all of a sudden, in these 20 years, basically all the all punishment becomes detention. So detention, imprisonment, colonizes the whole criminal justice. Instead of having like different penalties for different crimes, any crime pretty much is punished through prison. So we have the formation, first of all, of an administrative apparatus that is completely new, is separated and is almost independent from the criminal justice and from the judicial and from the legislative. In comparison with the monarchical system, we have secrecy. I mean, it happens like within closed walls where people do not have access, right? We don't have access to prisons. And this differs also from the dream of the reforming justice of a punitive city that could be a lesson for all. Maybe it is still a lesson for all, but it happens within closed walls and we don't see it. Interestingly, though, how do they justify the idea of the prison is by proposing rehabilitation, cure, right? Like, so the subject, which is within those enclosed spaces, is there in order to be rehabilitated, in order to be cured. And what is at stake is its body. Again, not the tortured body, not the soul, but its body, how it can be subjected to a new training, a retraining that changes its behavior. Why do they become does the prison system become so popular? First of all, we have like three great models of punitive imprisonment available in those years. Like one is the Rasphuis in Amsterdam. Then we have the Maison de Force in Ghent, Belgium, and then we have the Walnut Street Prison in Philadelphia. And there are basically three main principles that will survive also up to today, which is, first of all, is work. Work as a remedy against idleness. Work is basically the medicine that keeps us away from bad behavior. And I mean, and we can verify that in our lives, right? Like it's when we are free from work that we do, or we think of doing, the kind of things we are not supposed to. So work becomes a remedy, and especially like with a strict timetable. So life in this institution is organized like literally minute by minute, which makes me think of my own work. Minute by minute, it's organized in a way that there is always a task you have to do, always to keep yourself busy, so you cannot get distracted and think of the other alternative. You cannot use your imagination for thinking something different from what you're supposed to be doing, you're forced to be doing. At the same time, there is a constant supervision, always an observation that makes sure that the behavior of those inmates is the proper behavior and that don't engage with behaviors that can, basically those behaviors that led them within this institution. So like criminal behaviors, right? Like wrong behaviors, abnormal behaviors. We'll see all this in a minute. And then we have the modulation of penalty. So it's not just like that they've been committing a crime, so they receive a sentence, but the behavior within this institution counts towards their penalties. So if they behave well, they might have the chance to get out of this institution a bit earlier. If they don't behave well, if their behavior doesn't change, if there is no spiritual transformation, they are bound to stay there even longer with different kind of additional punishments within the prison. So we see that is already like an increasing autonomy of the penitentiary, of the decisions that are taken within the prisons in comparison with the law and the judicial. Now, For Foucault, this is not the only reason why prisons became so popular and became the only way of punishing within criminal justice. What Foucault sees is the emergence of this very tiny, very minute, he call it, very small and yet capillary, diffuse, going everywhere power that he calls disciplinary power. It's the power of the disciplines. And he finds this power at work even before the emergence of prison, before the birth of prisons, in several different contexts, which we are all familiar with. Uh, in the picture I chose like three different settings. Like one is like an educational setting, which looks quite a lot like a lecture theater in more contemporary universities, with some little differences, obviously, which people would not accept otherwise. But the scheme is pretty much the same, and is taken from a French prison with a lecture for alcoholists. In the middle, instead, we see two images of the perfect way of writing. So it's a school system again, but it's like, as you can see, it's the combination of the position of the hand in combination with the pen. And then in the top picture that you might not see very well because like I cover it with the title, is like also the standing straight, right? Standing straight, so your leg needs to be a little bit more in front, your shoulders. We all know this, right? And then on the other side is like an image of orthopedy. Orthopedy, is like, so it's the idea of medicine, right? There's the idea of like that even like a tree that is not straight, it can be made straight. And this is like pretty much medicine in general. So we have this very different context, but they come to a similar idea. And this is like, I took a quotation from Foucault because like I really blew my mind when I read it. Is it surprising that prisons resemble factories, schools, barracks, hospitals, which all resemble prisons? I think like many of you, especially during your school times, have thought, oh, my school looks like a prison. Then you go into work and you think, oh, my job is like a prison. Now we're living in in pandemic times, and this lockdown feels a bit like prison. Well, there is no coincidence. It's not that we are really in prisons, but it's because like these institutions really look pretty much the same. And what makes them look the same is disciplinary power. What is discipline? It's a series of methods that go throughout society in a very discrete forms, like that you sort of don't even realize that they are so common and so widespread and so meticulously organized, which basically have two functions. They make the body and our forces, the forces connected to our body, docile and useful. Discipline increases the forces of the body, and this is in terms of economic utility. So for instance, like when we are at work, disciplines make us work harder, be more productive, more increasing our productivity in order to make our work more profitable for our bosses, basically. Even at school, we are trained in order to improve our skills, but even like in a hospital, you have the same kind of setting, right? Like you make your body more useful, basically. Any pathology needs to be eliminated so that the body can function more effectively. And this is the same principle that happens in the army. At the same time, it diminishes the forces of the body, the same forces, in political terms of obedience. So we have these forces. We can use them in a million different ways, and yet we use them in a very effective way, which means we need to eliminate all those forces that could distract us from these objectives, from the objective of being useful and productive from an economic perspective. So what it needs to diminish, to decrease, is our political potential for resistance, for using these forces in a completely different way from what is prescribed to us. Now, how does disciplinary power work? Basically, we have, first of all, observation. So constant observation, we constantly observed in a hierarchized way. So basically, we are within a hierarchy, and the people above us will supervise our actions, our behaviors, and they will decide what to do with us. Like, so there is a constant being looked, right? Like we are looked by someone else. It can be people, it can be a CCTV camera, it can be a medical record, it can be an analysis, it can be any sort of, but the whole observation in which like we are objectified, right? Like we are treated as an object of knowledge. We are made visible, first of all, because like if you think about it, like we assume that our lives are very often unimportant to our, but instead we are always put like on a spotlight, like a power looks at us, like makes our lives, our bodies, our forces visible, and it organizes a whole knowledge about it, a whole explanation of what we are, what we look like, and so on and so forth. So together with this observation, there is a normalizing judgment. So it's not so much about the law. The law, what does the law do? It's like divides the legal from the illegal. The norm, instead, is much more powerful because the norm captures every single behavior. Why? Because like the normality is constituted as an average to which everything can be compared to. So basically, everything can be ranked. And you have various degrees of normality. You can get close to be normal, you can be fully normal, or you can be abnormal. And so the norm distributes our bodies, our forces, our behaviors into different categories, different rankings, partitioning us into different spaces and into appropriate kind of trainings that can bring us back to the norm. So the normal becomes like the very strong and powerful effect of this disciplinary, an instrument of these disciplinary powers. And the examination is basically the combination of this observation and this normalizing judgment. And we go through examination basically in all stages of our lives, in all these different institutions. Historically, the emergence of disciplinary power comes with the emergence of a particular form of economic system, which is the system that we still live in today, which is the system of capitalism. Why? Before capitalism, so we're talking about like the 17th century, basically, economic production is organized into the small households. So basically, a family produces something for their own and maybe a little bit extra to sell on the market. Very few people coming together, basically, a family, just few people. When you start thinking about factories instead, you have a big multiplicity of people, a lot of bodies, a lot of forces that need to be controlled, supervised, observed, examined, and made useful. So the accumulation of bodies correspond to the accumulation of capital, of wealth. And this is how capitalism was organized. So it's no coincidence that all these different institutions emerge around this time. So we have basically a series of different institutions that are enclosed institutions, schools, hospitals, barracks, factories, and prisons that arrive to every single detail of society. It's a capillary control, it's a continuous control, uninterrupted, because like we all move from one institution to the other. We move from depending on our life stages, but also depending on the rhythm of the day. So we move from a hospital to a workplace, we were at school, or we are at school, universities, and so on and so forth. And then to make this network even more capillary, more continuous, we have the emergence in those same years of the police apparatus, of a centralized state police apparatus, which basically connects these different institutions. What does the police do, basically? It controls and disciplines those spaces that are non-disciplinary. So basically what happens in between the street, pretty much, right? Like the street and all the other aspects of life which are not captured within these closed institutions. So as we can see, we have a whole apparatus which at the end of the day is basically the reproduction of a system of power in which one class dominates above another class. We'll see that more in detail later on, but you can already start feeling the function of this disciplinary power, how this disciplinary power reproduces is an instrument, but is also an effect of a specific class domination. And when we talk about class, we can fill up the idea of class also with all other sorts of inequalities. So race inequality and race domination as well, but also gender inequalities and gender domination as well, so patriarchy. So all these systems interconnect within this idea of disciplinary power that emerges within the 19th century, together with the emergence of capitalism. We arrive here to the famous, because like you must have heard of it. Like if you're not, like it's gonna be hopefully kind of interesting. The idea of the Panopticon. This is the inside of the prisons I show you in the very first slide. This is the Presidio Maximo. I chose this picture again because like it's a dead prison. Prisons can die as well, and it will be beautiful to wait for the moment in which they all disappear. By the way, this is the prison where Fidel Castro was imprisoned for his first attempt to take over power in Cuba against the dictatorship of Batista. He was in prison for a number of years, so they tried to re-educate him. As the history of Cuba and its revolution tell us, it didn't really work out. Foucault makes it, Foucault connects the idea of panopticon with something that will sound terribly familiar today, and that I would have never expected when I first read Discipline and Punish a few years ago, that this would be so resounding with my own life, with our own life today. So where does this idea of panopticon and panopticism come from? It looks at the end of the 17th century, where we have the plague, which affects pretty much most of Europe. And I mean, it comes to me naturally to smile about it, because like when you see the accounts from the way in which the plague was treated, it sounds so terribly familiar with today's pandemic. We have like a city that they basically basically a strict lockdown where nobody moves, which much more control than what we experience, at least in the UK today. Where basically what happens is that like officials go door to door to check upon all the people within their households and check whether they are alive, whether there are some victims, whether there is the disease, and then this is the way of preventing further contagion. Foucault says that everyone locked up in his cage, everyone at his window, answering to his name and showing himself when asked. This is the great review of the living and the dead. Now, this is like the perfect visualization or the political dream of the disciplined society. because like we have like continuous surveillance, observation, documentation, because like those officials take notes of what's happening. If we have a town that is completely immobilized by the functioning of this extensive power that arrives to every inch of society and governs the city perfectly, basically, even if it's not moving at all, so it's not productive enough, but perfectly productive in terms of a disciplined society. Now, this is very different from what we had in the previous pandemic of the time that was the leper, in which the organization was completely based on exile and exclusion. So those who the lepers would be removed from the city and confined in a closed space in an exile, basically. And this is the political dream of a pure community, right? Like a community that takes out disease and brings it somewhere else, and relocates it somewhere else where it can be excluded and where the community can be protected. The Panopticon is basically the merging of these two approaches, where the dominant approach is definitely the disciplined society, but basically the Panopticon, Foucault says, treat lepers as plague victims, individualize the excluded. So we have the combination of these two aspects. Let's look at the Panopticon, how it works. Like it's this terrible machine, this terrible structure that is basically mainly used in prisons, but not only in prisons, because it's a machine that can be used anywhere in all those disciplinary institutions. How does it work? There is a tower in the middle of a circular or semicircular structure, and then there are individual cells all around this tower. Now, as you can imagine, control and supervision comes from the tower. Now, instead of having like a high number of supervisors that would control each inmate, what we have here is just like one person that can be in the tower from a position in which the prisoners would never know whether somebody's watching them or not. And this is key. Also because like it resounds like while with all the principles of CCTV cameras, like we see a CCTV camera, we don't know if anybody's behind the camera watching us, but we tend to internalize that feeling of surveillance, this feeling of being observed, and we tend to behave. I mean, like I'm not suggesting that you would do anything wrong in general, but you might. But you might not, you would definitely not do it if you have a CCTV camera there, unless you have like circumstances in which you're forced to do it or you really want to do it. That's another story. But the principle of Panopticon is like a continuous observation, which is almost internalized by the prisoners. The prisoners don't know whether they have been seen or not seen, because they are seen, but they cannot see themselves, the one who's seeing them. So it's a complex economy of visibility, a whole technology of regulating visibility. And this is very interesting because it's extremely effective and extremely economic. So we have continuous observation. We obtain the kind of behavior we want to impose upon the inmates. So we have a machine that functions pretty much automatically. And Bentham says, like, yeah, there can be one guardian, there can be some family member of the guardian, it can be another supervisor, or anybody can enter and look at that. Now, interestingly, it's not just like the inmates that are being observed, but it's also the supervisor that is observed, because like you can whoever is going to inspect the institution is going to immediately see whether the institution is effective or not. So it's a principle of not just permanent observation, but also continuous observation, both on the observe and on the observers that become observed on their turn. So it becomes like also almost an impersonal machine. Doesn't matter who runs it, doesn't matter who's watching. It's a mechanism. I really like the idea of a machine because it expresses this impersonality. It's like it becomes something that is functioning perfectly and effectively without the personal or subjective contribution of any individual. The Panopticon is the architectural idea of Jeremy Bentham, utilitarian English philosopher. Utilitarian, like, is the way in which like this philosopher were defined, and it's really interesting because like with all the contradiction that utility as a concept might have in this case. And it says moral reform, health preserved, economy invigorated, instruction diffused, all by a simple idea in architecture. It sounds like effortless, basically. So with a simple idea of architecture, you achieve utility and docility in all these different contexts. Remember, prisons, schools, hospitals, barracks, workshops, factories, and so on and so forth, a monastery, by simply organizing space. So because architecture is about space, in a specific way that allows continuous observation and permanent supervision and surveillance. So this is the essence of disciplinary power. And obviously, like, this model goes beyond the walls of these institutions. And I took this quotation because like I couldn't avoid to be impressed by the words that he's using and how much they are resounding today. And Foucault says that one can speak of the formation of a disciplinary society in this movement that stretches from the enclosed disciplines, a sort of social quarantine, to an indefinitely generalizable mechanism of panopticism. So it's a mechanism that can be diffused pretty much everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's within the walls of these institutions, but it goes also beyond the walls of these institutions and pervades the whole of society. We come to the last section. I'll tell you later where this picture was taken. So what do we have then is the formation of what Foucault calls a carceral archipelago. So basically an imagination of this society where all these different institutions, like in an archipelago basically, are little islands connected by this common sea, which is basically the police in a way, or not just the police, but it's also the internalization of surveillance and control. Even when we are not controlled, we feel control, we tend to behave because like we are so disciplined, we are so trained all our life, basically, all the minimum aspects of our life, all the minimum usage of our bodies, of our forces, of the forces of our bodies are so disciplined that we constantly feeling trapped, produced rather than trapped by this disciplinary power. I say produced because like this is like an important, and this is like possibly one of the biggest contribution of Foucault's philosophy on the idea of power. So what we're seeing here is not so much that power prohibits, that power says no to us. What power does is to transform us into productive subjects. So power produces us as subjects. And Foucault uses this wonderful French word that is associatissement, which contains both aspects of becoming subjects. So on the one hand, power makes us subjects in the sense that we need to be subjects ourselves. We need to act. A subject acts, right? Like a subject is the mover of his own action, of her own actions, right? But at the same time, by becoming a subject, with all the responsibility that comes with it, we becoming subjected to power. And power, basically, in this double movement of associatism, of subjectivation, it acts upon our actions. So our actions are sort of determined by power. So it's not a prohibition, it's not just saying don't do that, but it's more about producing a specific action, a specific behavior. Do that, which is go to work, study, go to work, be productive, be useful to society, produce profits to for your bosses, and so on and so forth. So disciplinary power, power in general, is what generates an action on the side of those subjected to it. Now, this disciplinary power, which is not the only power at work in society, according to Foucault, but this is like another story. Maybe we can have another discussion on other forms of power. But this specific form of power, technology of power, condensed within the carceral apparatus, so not just the prison itself, but all the disciplinary institutions that function pretty much like the prison, condensed like a political moral scheme of isolation and hierarchy. So the individual as a fabrication, separated from horizontally from the others, from the solidarity and resistance that is available between the people, hierarchy, an economic model of compulsory work that happens within prison but also outside prison, and the technico-medical model of cure and normalization. So what is the excuse to lock people up? Is we're going to rehabilitate you, we're going to cure you, we're going to make you normal again. Does this happen? No, never, and we all know that. And they all know that as well. Now, what is interesting, though, is this transformation, that what is at stake here is not so much the crime, is not so much the act that brought a particular individual to jail, but it's his life. So he becomes the delinquent, because it's not so much what is done, but his behavior, his overall behavior, his way of using his body, his way of using his attitudes, of having specific preferences and passions that need to be cured and normalized. And it says the criminal exists even before the crime and even outside of the crime. And this is a criminological labyrinth in which we also arrive to, for instance, to Lombroso kind of approach to criminology, in which like he could tell whether you were a criminal from your face, from the size of your nose, of the distance between the nose and your mouth. So sort of preventing crime by individuating criminal traits within your body. That sounds like an exaggeration, but in general, we have the formation of this idea of a dangerous individual that can be anticipated and can be cured as well, normalized, so that it will desist. The idea of desistance, right? Like introducing desistance within criminal behaviors. And the dangerous individual basically connects a juridical subject that needs to be rehabilitated and the monster, because like the criminal is the monster, the abnormal, right? And they are mixed together and they are made acceptable to society with the idea of cure, of the idea of normalization. And yet we know that it doesn't work. I mean, like we know as a fact that prison never rehabilitates. Prison actually produces more, produces criminality, produces delinquency in particular. We'll see that in a second. Now, Foucault compares the critiques that emerged basically at the very beginning of the birth of the prison. There were immediately critiques that sounds exactly like the critiques that we hear today about the prison. So crime is ferments within prisons, like the criminals enter there, and prison is sort of a school for criminals. Or other critiques could be once you get out of prison, they're gonna end up in jail once again, because like they're not gonna find a job. But at the same time, like those critiques that have always been there, pretending that also like prison is a way of scaring people off, and so it should work as for the elimination of crime. That never happens, because like crime has been constant since since the birth of prison. What is the solution? What are the solution proposed? Is more prison, is more rehabilitation, more correction, and but yeah, it's never enough. So he says like for a century and a half, and we could add like for 2 centuries now, the prison had always been offered as its own remedy. The reactivation of the penitentiary techniques as the only means of overcoming their perpetual failure, the realization of the corrective project as the only method of overcoming the impossibility of implementing it. So he asks, like, is it not supposed is it not the supposed failure part of the functioning of the prison? And the answer is yes. I mean, like, for as much as like they pretend to criticize it, as for as much the prisons looks like as a failure project, it is not. It's perfectly functioning as it should, because what it has to do, according to Foucault, is not so much eliminate crime or re-educate or rehabilitate. Those are basically the function that are the instrument and the effect of disciplinary power in general, as we have seen. We are so used to disciplinary power that we accept it even to justify that prison exists. Now, the biggest function, according to Foucault, is the fabrication of delinquency. What is delinquency? It's like this segment of the population that basically ends up in jail maybe once, and then twice, and maybe 3 times. Like so, it's like this petty criminality, because like they never catch big criminals, do they? Delinquency is useful for society. First of all, because it justifies an extensive police power, an extensive disciplinary power, an extensive surveillance, right? So we all accept that there are CCTV cameras everywhere because we need to prevent crime. We need to prevent those delinquents to attack us, to attack our lives and our property, as if we had any property in most of the cases. And also, like, we all know that police like has a benefit of dealing with these delinquents, and with which like has a strong connection, right? Like they exchange information, and then by capturing one, then maybe you can extract information that can lead to capturing more than one, and so on and so forth. And we see that basically the majority of the people in prisons are in there for really petty crimes that we wouldn't necessarily perceive as dangerous to society. For instance, like small drug dealing or drug consumptions. I mean, like, yeah, I suspect, I hope that none of the people watching this don't think like that those are big crimes, right? So what does Foucault say is that the fabrication of delinquency is a way of managing and handling a general realm of illegalities. What are illegalities? Are all those deviation from the law that happen from two sides, basically. Those are the illegalities that delinquency wants to protect somehow. First of all, it allows the illegalities of the dominant class. Think about drug trafficking. Big drug trafficking is obviously connected with the big capitals, the big actors of the capitalist system. We are talking about huge amount of money. Those never go to jail. You can think of El Chapo, but it's like one-off. I mean, you can always think about like the big narco trafficking guy, but then as the very big ones, like obviously like have such huge disposal of money that need to be connected to the real economy. There must be a continuity between like these big traffickers and the big capitalists. Like I'm not suggesting that Jeff Bezos is a is a narcos, but I mean like those money need to circulate, and when we're talking about this huge amount of money, they need to circulate, and jail is not the place for them. So on the one hand, delinquency allows the illegalities of the dominant class, but what it does also is to what happens like in the lower classes, in those classes that could resist, that could revolt, that could rebel against those dominant powers, is to disentangle their resistant potential. Remove solidarity, remove horizontality. By segmenting the lower classes, what happens is that resistance and the chances of resistance are partly lower. I say lower because they don't disappear. It's interesting that says like that, I mean, and those are like anarchist theories of the 19th century, that in every criminal, basically, there is a fragment of resistance against power and against the way in which society is organized. And this is like a very beautiful kind of way of approaching this story, because like resistance can take many forms, as I hope we will see, can take a couple many forms, and in some cases like it can be like criminal forms, but in other cases like can be forms of solidarity, forms of cooperation, horizontal cooperation against power. So the idea of separating this portion of popular illegalities and identifying a specific segment of these popular illegalities as delinquency, as the population that will go to jail, that will stay in jail, that will be in jail, and so on and so forth, is a way of preventing disorder, okay, preventing resistance. But, and this comes like to the positive note, because like so far it seems like that we have described a perfect society that is organized in a way that prevents any form of resistance. But the book Discipline and Punish finishes like with this wonderful sentence, and I'll tell you now what the picture is, where I took the picture from. You see a massive break, a massive hole in the wall, and that was like the prison in Rovigo in Italy, north of Italy, where Prima Linea, which was like translated like is the first line, it was a political movement, far left, extreme left movement, communist movement that liberate basically a unit of Prima Linea that liberated some comrades that were imprisoned in that jail, but obviously like blowing up the a hole in the wall and managing to get some comrades out of jail. By the way, one was like not just a comrade, but the partner of one of Sergio Sego, that was the organizer of this attack. So sometimes like prison walls break or blow up. So I think like that's for me something like beautiful as a perspective, for even though like a person died during the attack, but that's a different story. If you want to talk more about it, like we can discuss it, obviously. Foucault ends his book with this beautiful, I find it very beautiful sentence. Now, what I wanted to emphasize is that like many readers of Foucault tend to see Foucault as describing power as this very strong and monolithic and impossible to escape, impossible to resist force that compels our lives and forces us to live in a specific way. I like to think that actually all Foucault's work is about resistance, and I hope that I sort of demonstrated through the reading of Discipline and Punish that I proposed during this talk. He says, in this central and centralized humanity, the effect and instrument of complex power relations, bodies and forces subjected by multiple mechanisms of incarcerations, objects for discourses that are in themselves elements for this strategy, we must hear the distant roar of the battle. I found this very beautiful because like it expresses the idea that the battle is not over, that resistance has still got its chances of transforming society, of transforming our lives, of transforming the way in which we live together. And this allows us to imagine and dream maybe but not just dream, possibly practicing also, a world without inequalities, a world without exploitation, a world without prisons. I want to conclude like with this, with the lyrics of a very beautiful song from 1973 by Fabrizio De André, who was an anarchist songwriter from Genoa, Italy. And it's the album Storia di un impiegato is like a very beautiful album. Like there are several songs that are worth listening to. And if you don't know him, like I strongly recommend it. I took this one like which is about prison, and I want to stress your attention to a couple of bits of the song. Like is this prisoner talking, and he says, "I didn't expect a mistake from you, men and women of the courthouse. Had I been in your place, but I'm not able to be in your place." And I think is this like sort of irreducibility, right? Like is this division between two sides, the judge and the prisoner, but more in general is like power and resistance, I would say. Those that perform power, those that exert power, and those that in many different places, in many different circumstances, in many different aspects of our lives, we resist, we perform resistance, and it says at the end like it talks about like we go through a big obedience training, right? Like that is last all our lives, in which like we are led to believe that we need to behave in a certain way, that violence is something that we might be responsible for, but then if we do another sort of exercise, another change of our mindset, we can understand that actually like power always operates in a way that is sort of violent, that suppresses our individualities, that changes our forces, changes our behaviors in a way that is functional for a system of domination, a system of inequalities that can be capitalist inequality in terms of class, but also in terms of race and in terms of gender. So all these kind of inequalities come from a perspective in which we can understand power as something to resist. And this is like a little bit, allow me to do a little bit of self-promotion, but it's also the coincidence that today, the day in which I'm recording this talk, is also the day in which my book has just been published. The title of my book is I feel very embarrassed to do this. The title of my book is The Primacy of Resistance, in which I discuss the concept of resistance in the work of Michel Foucault, and I try to push it a bit further, because like I think in Michel Foucault's work, like the concept of resistance is here and there, is in the interstices, in this small break through the walls of power, if we refer to the image that we've seen earlier. I don't talk so much about prisons in my book, but I talk about resistance a lot, not just in Foucault, but also using other philosophers. The book is out today and is really expensive, so I understand that nobody will be willing to buy it. But if you're willing to have a look at that, you can drop me an email, and I'm more than happy to send you the PDF of the book for free, obviously, because like at the end of the day, as we say at the beginning, research or knowledge in general is something partisan, and so knowledge should work towards a political objective in any case. And obviously like the political objective that I try to mobilize in my research and in my talk today is like the idea of a resistance that goes not just about opposition to power, but beyond power, for constructing a society based on solidarity, mutualism, and against inequalities and exploitation. So this is my email address. If you want to drop me an email, either for the book or to discuss further what I discuss in this talk, or maybe even to organize a reading group on discipline and punish, that would be really, really beautiful, because obviously like I try to give you an overview of the book, but the book is so rich and so dense that we could discuss the book for a very long time. So if there is any chance that you would like to continue this conversation, this discussion, because I think that the core of knowledge is collective discussion, please drop me an email and I'll be really honored and happy to hear your comments about these, and more in general, your comments about the ideas that we discussed today. Thank you for your attention if you made it to this point, and I hope you have a great day today. Bye.